Chapter 21. Jonah, driven to kill. Within an hour of finding the address in Michael's room, I arrived outside a 4-story office building. The building stood in the middle of a gated compound and looked well overdue for a fresh lick of paint and some structural renovation. Climbing out of a yellow cab, I paid the driver with a handful of Nigerian banknotes. "God bless you, sir," the driver said, with a broad smile. Entering the compound through a manually operated sliding gate that had been left open, I zipped past the security guard, who was napping under a tree, and headed over to the building's front entrance. I walked into an empty lobby, where a pretty girl was examining her nails behind a reception counter. Sitting on a high stool, she flashed a look at me and carried on with what she was doing. "Moonlight investigations," I said. Visibly jolted, the girl glanced up at me again. It was evident she was surprised at the sound of my London accent, which in this city appeared to suggest you were somehow higher up the social food chain. Straightening up, she delivered an apologetic smile. "Third floor, sir." Heading up the stairwell, I arrived on the 3rd floor. Then I made my way down the corridor that held a string of offices and stopped outside the one I was looking for. Twisting open the door handle, I let myself in and entered a bright, fluorescent-lit room. An attractive, dark-skinned woman was seated behind a glass desk. An open laptop before her. She appeared startled as I walked in. However, given that such a reaction was nothing new to me, I was unfazed. I glimpsed a flash of anger in her eyes, a reaction akin to a feeling of being disrespected, a "how dare you" expression for barging in without so much as knocking. I stared at her with a deadpan look, hoping to fire home the message that social etiquette was, at least for now, not exactly a priority of mine. "Can I help you?" she demanded. Her voice was cold. I closed the door behind me and I turned the key in the lock. I whipped back around and came face to face with a Glock 22, a lethal firearm with a small frame and a short barrel. Made it ideal for concealed carry. "Ever used one of those things before?" I said. "There's always a first time." I whipped out the piece of paper with the name and address scribbled on it. I waved it like a white flag. Then I strolled up to the desk and slid the paper across the table. She didn't look at it. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Are you shadowing on so?" "What if I am?" "I'm looking for Michael." She reached for the paper and gave it a quick glance, the gun still fixed in my direction. "I don't understand." "Where is he?" "Are you related?" I didn't answer and repeated myself, only this time emphasizing each word. "Where is he?" Her face hardened again. "You've got 30 seconds, she said. "He's been gone for 2 days, I replied. "What?" "I don't find him in the next 12 hours. I'm probably looking at retrieving a corpse." She lowered the gun. "You're his brother, aren't you?" I said nothing. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Small talk isn't exactly my favorite pastime," I said. "So let's start again." "Where?" She didn't let me finish. "I found him a name and address." "Whose name and address?" "The man I believe is responsible for your family's loss." I glanced around the room for the second time. Feeling the cool air from a wall-installed air conditioning unit, I couldn't but notice how clean and immaculate everything was. Cream marble tiles to match cream-coloured walls, and in perfect contrast to the two, a black leather couch. Over in a quiet corner, a Persian rug had been rolled up and placed in an upright position, wrapped in plastic The rug looked as though it had been purchased recently and was intended to eventually serve as a welcome addition to the general aesthetic of the room. I turned my attention back to the woman, who was no longer holding the gun. It was my first criminal assignment. She shrugged her shoulders. I guess I just got lucky. You got anything else? I said. I think I know where your brother might have gone. She scooped a smartphone up from her desk, thumbed the screen a couple of times, and showed me a text message from Michael. The message revealed he was in the company of the police officer I suspected was Rambo. It pointed out that their intended location was Abuja City. I've been trying to reach him after I got a call from my source, Sade said. Your source? A working girl. She's worried about a friend of hers who was in the car when the accident happened. Where's the friend now? Apparently she accompanied the driver home and hasn't been seen since. I heard a sound from the door and pivoted around. The door handle was being slowly twisted open. Expecting someone? No one I can recall. Someone pushed gently against the locked door. This was followed by a single knock. Who is it? Sade said. A brief pause and then a man's voice answered. Sade Nonso? She glanced at me before answering. Who wants to know? I have an urgent message. The voice on the other side of the door replied. From who? Michael Echo. Her face lit up. Looks like there's someone here who can help, she whispered. I wasn't convinced. Need you to disappear for a minute, I said. What? Just do it. She gave me one of those I won't have a man tell me what to do looks, crossed over to a room that appeared to be a kitchen and shut herself inside. I walked over to the door, twisted the key clockwise and opened it. A man wearing wire-rimmed glasses stood on the other side. He was clad in a smart suit and had a fixed smile on his face. Just over 6 foot, he had both his arms held out in front of him, his right hand clasped over his left in a superficially non-threatening pose. To the untrained eye, the image of a lawyer or a businessman, but not when you had razor-sharp instincts like mine. His smile seemed somewhat contrived, giving an unnatural tightness to his face. The fresh look of a pinstriped suit gave the appearance of an item that had just come off a store rack. But there were other signs too, signs of a more ominous nature, the dark calluses on his knuckles and the thin shade of what looked like an old knife scar across his chin. A professional, I thought to myself. A professional assassin. I stepped to one side and beckoned for him to enter. He walked inside, his eyes scanning the surroundings like an android from a sci-fi picture. I closed the door and locked it once again. He stopped mid-motion as he heard the sound of the key turn in the lock. With his back facing me, he said, "Very bright in here." I said nothing, took a few steps towards him, and stopped a couple of feet away. He removed his glasses, pushed them into the breast pocket of his jacket, and turned around. "Where is she?" he demanded quietly. I said nothing. For a moment we stared at each other in silence, like a pair of gunslingers in a spaghetti western. And then I made the first move. A deliberate move that was intended to maneuver him into a preferred position. I took a step to my left and watched as he did the same. Both his arms still out in front of him, his right hand still clasped over the left. I repeated the motion a couple more times and watched him rotate 90 degrees, his back now facing the wall. A tense moment followed. Then the corners of his mouth twisted into a snarl, and a gleaming blade flashed from a switchblade concealed in his left hand. Swinging the weapon from the waist up, he was quick, blindingly so. but I was quicker. Grabbing hold of his wrist with my left hand, I brought his thrust to a dead stop. Shooting out my right, I seized him by the neck, reversed him into the wall, and rammed the back of his head through a giant glass-framed wall sign which had the words Moonlight Investigations Lagos spelt out in bold, fancy letters. The frame shattered on impact, and I was left staring into a pair of eyes as soulless as those of a mannequin. His face began to tighten, determined to drive home the blade. In a standoff I had no intention of conceding, I quickly decided what needed to happen next. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, or even genuinely considered, but as someone once said, anyone can be driven to kill. It is the one skill set that requires no training, only a cause, a trigger, the perfect storm for which there is no feasible alternative. I continued to stare at the grimace on the assassin's face and the ruthless detachment in his vacant eyes. Then, in a strategy manifested on the spot, I brought the event to an immediate and fatal conclusion. Releasing my grip from his neck, I closed my right hand around his wrist and leapt off to one side. In a swooping, arc-like motion, I turned the assassin's arm back onto himself, rammed the blade of the knife into his suprasternal notch, and using the heel of my palm, slammed onto the hilt of the weapon for good measure. It was a maneuver I'd seen in a recent action flick, one that was supposed to be a quiet but surefire way of killing your enemy. Hammering a sharp object into the prominent dip between the neck and the collarbone. A theory that was corroborated by the assassin's immediate reaction. Taking a step back, I watched the man collapse to his knees. He crashed to one side and curled up in a fetal position, his arms and body spasming like a man in the middle of an epileptic fit. Gurgling like a drowning man, the assassin's eyes rolled to the back of his head. Coughing up blood for the duration, a river of the same flowed from the entry wound like a ruptured drainpipe. I watched him in silence as he died. This was the first time I had ever taken a life, but I felt nothing at all for this individual who was likely to have a body count of victims stretching several miles. After about 5 minutes, the spasms stopped. I saw a light begin to flicker from his trousers. Crouching down beside him, I reached into his pocket and pulled out a smartphone. The name Rambo was flashing up on the screen in bold letters. I waited until the flashing stopped. Then I tapped on the screen with my thumb, accessed the assassin's message box, and responded with a text message. "We'll let you know when I'm done." Seconds later, a message was sent in return from Rambo. "Make sure you do." I stared at the screen, hoping I'd bought Michael a little more time. I heard a muffled gasp and spun around. Sade stood behind me. She stared at the body, her hand clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide open. "How did he know my name?" she stuttered. I said nothing and rose to my feet. I mean, Michael would never have given out my personal details unless he had been tortured, I said. She stared at me in disbelief. "But why?" she gasped. I said nothing and glanced at my watch. It was almost 3 p.m. "We need to move the body," I said. Chapter 22. Michael. Threshold for pain. My eyelids fluttered open to what looked like an empty room. I was strapped to a chair, my arms outstretched before me, my head still spinning, still reeling from the oversized fist that had made contact with what my primary school peers had cruelly described as a glass jaw. Lowering my chin, I discovered both my feet were bound together by the ankles. Furious that Balogun, Rambo, or whatever the bastard chose to call himself, had sold me out for a sizable sum of cash, I realized the real question was not why a sickening, corrupt police officer had shown his true face, but why a man who had already taken the lives of 2 innocent people wanted me held hostage in the first place. Tipping up my head, I surveyed my surroundings. A couple of items across the room had me worried. A Louis Vuitton branded handbag dumped in a corner and a shovel caked with dry soil balanced against the wall. I froze as the door slammed open and a giant muscle-bound man entered the room. He was wearing a white vest, football-sized biceps bulging beneath glistening dark skin. Holding a metal toolbox in his right hand, he marched over to where I sat and set the item down before me. I looked up and stared at his towering frame, utterly convinced he was the same man responsible for putting my lights out. I heard a voice. "Good to see you're awake." Juku was standing by the open door, an asthma inhaler in the grip of his hand. He took a blast of air from the pump, closed the door behind him, and strolled over. "What do you want from me?" He glanced at the giant, who grabbed another wooden chair close by and planted it before me. Juku sat down on it. "I need to know who you've been talking to," he said. "What do you mean?" "My name, my address. Who gave them to you?" I looked at him, and a surge of rage shot through me. "You killed the only real parents I ever knew." A look of embarrassment appeared on his face. "I didn't kill anyone," he said. "Don't lie to me." He smiled quietly. "It was an accident." "Then why haven't you turned yourself in?" He stared at me as though I was insane. "Now why would I do a thing like that?" "There's no way you're going to get away with this," I said. "I already have," he replied. He took another blast of air from the asthma pump. "The only thing you need to concern yourself with is telling me exactly what I want to know." "I'm not telling you a thing," I yelled. "You hear me? Nothing." He nodded, casually scratched the back of his neck. "Okay, let me put it to you another way. You see that handbag over there?" With a sideways jerk of his head, he indicated the Louis Vuitton bag. I turned to look at the bag, which was likely to have been a young lady's prized possession. "What did you do to her?" I said. He smiled. "Not me." He pointed up at the muscle-bound henchman, who was now standing behind me like a towering oak tree. "Him." I swallowed a lump in my throat, hoping I'd be spared the details. Leaning forward in an up-close and personal manner, Juku whispered in my ear, "So here's the deal. You tell me what I need to know, and I guarantee the same won't happen to you." I swallowed another lump in my throat. "I can't." He nodded sadly, returned to his previous position, and said, "Do you know how information is extracted from prisoners of war?" "Why would I know a thing like that?" "Just curious," he said under his breath. He rose to his feet and stepped away from the chair. "You see, various methods can be used to free a man's tongue, but there is one in particular I have a special preference for." He looked at the giant and nodded. In response, the giant circled round to my front, crouched down by the toolbox, and flipped back the lid. Looking at me again, Juku grimaced like a man whose hand was being forced. I really need you to tell me who you spoke to and where I can find them, he said. I glanced down at the contents of the toolbox. There was a giant hammer, a bunch of nails, and the one instrument that sent a chill down my spine, a pair of pliers. The giant reached for the pliers. Last chance, Juku whispered. I took a deep breath and gazed up at Juku, terrified but defiant. Fuck you, I screamed. Juku turned to the giant and nodded for a second time. The man rose to his feet, dreaded pliers in hand. Instinctively, I tightened up, rammed my teeth shut, and began thrashing my head violently from side to side, like a drowning man at the mercy of a great white. For a moment, the giant did nothing. He watched quietly. With expert timing, he swiftly shot out an open right hand, clawed me by the chin, and locking my head into position, sunk a rigid thumb into one cheek, a solid forefinger into the other, and forced open my mouth. Releasing a desperate growl from the pit of my stomach, I braced myself for the inevitable as he snapped open the pliers, clamped onto a central insea, and in a single motion yanked the tooth free. The pain was blinding. My screams engulfed the room, and blood spurted across my shirt and onto the floor. I felt the pliers lock onto the next tooth. A lateral incisor was torn free. The pain, like a sharp dagger, being brutally driven into the roof of one's mouth. The room began to spin like a vicious carousel. The bitter taste of cold metal filled my mouth as the weaponized tool slipped across my tongue and snapped onto a molar. Gagging, I heard myself say something, wasn't quite sure what. Like a bolt of electricity from a cattle prod, another explosion of pain, I blacked out. Moments later, the room came alive with the sound of Juku's voice. Still in the haze of darkness, I figured he was talking to someone. Moonlight investigations, I heard him say. A chill ran down my spine. Opening my eyes, I saw that he was standing with his back to me. He was holding a smartphone logged onto what looked like Shade Nonso's website. My shirt felt sticky and wet. I gazed downwards and noticed it was covered in vomit. His handset was on its speakerphone setting. I heard another person's voice, a voice identical to that of Balogun. Moonlight investigations. That's as much as we could get from him, Juku said. But thanks to Google, it looks like I have an address and a name for you. I'm ready. Number 14 Allen Avenue. It looks like he has been speaking to a woman called Shade Nonso. What about the money? I heard Balogun say. You'll get it, but I'm going to need proof. Proof? A photograph of the body once the job is completed. No problem, I heard Balogun reply. The phone returned to the familiar dial tone. What have I done? I mumbled under my breath. Juku and the giant whipped around. The giant started towards me. He stopped as Juku raised a hand. What have you done? Juku walked over and crouched down before me. What anyone in your position would do, he said. I shook my head in protest. No! Yes, he replied, as if to correct some misunderstanding. Everyone has a pain threshold, and you just reached yours. I looked at him in desperation. You don't have to do this. This woman's just a private investigator, not a police officer. He stared at me, but said nothing. She stands nothing to gain from telling anyone what's happened, I emphasized. He paused for a spell. Maybe so. He rose back up. But I can't risk it. You see, timing, as they say, is everything. For instance, 5 years ago, none of this would have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered what you knew or what you could prove. Another pause. Because my father's word was law. in this town. He smiled quietly. Unfortunately, that day is gone. So like everyone else out here, I'm just trying to survive. He turned to look at the giant. Once we get confirmation, you know what to do. I looked at Juku with a fresh hatred, but I had one consolation. As long as he held me captive at 6'5" and 250 pounds, the one man he would never escape from was Jonah. Chapter 23. Jonah, Third Mainland. Moving a 6'1", 196-pound body from a 3-story building in broad daylight was always going to be a complex endeavor. However, the rolled-up rug in Shaday's office struck me as being a potential solution to the immediate dilemma. I'm going to have to use your rug, I told Shaday. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. My rug? I didn't answer but went straight to work. Driving the office desk up against the wall, I tore the plastic wrapping from the rug and flattened it out on the floor. I rolled the assassin's body onto it, flipping the body like a heavy tire, and folded the rug into the shape of a tube. Turning back to Shaday, I said, I'm going to need some rope, a couple of large bin bags, and some black tape. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with the tape, the bags, and a broken electric cord. She handed over all 3 items. Couldn't find any rope, but that cord's very strong. Good, I said. I noticed that she also came along with a couple of things I didn't request but were equally as important: a mop and a bucket of water. With no further discussion, she used the mop to go to work on a pool of blood in the middle of the room. I got busy also. Strapping the rug tight with the electric cord, I wrapped and taped each side of the rug with a bin bag to conceal any signs of the body. Looking over at Shaday, who was nearly done with the floor, I said, "Got a car?" She stopped and turned to look at me, out front. "Decent room?" She paused for a moment. "I'm not sure I want to be a part of this," she said. "Someone was hired to kill you, I'd say. That ship's just sailed," I replied. She acknowledged my perspective with a nod. "It's a 4x4, she said. I stripped off my shirt and handed it to her, leaving me wearing a white vest which, in light of what I was about to do, gave me the advantage of looking like several of the labourer-type individuals I had seen around the city. Heaving the enclosed body onto my shoulder, I turned to Shaday. "You're driving," I said. 5 minutes later, we were out of the door. Walking behind Shaday, I followed the same corridor and stairwell I'd used 30 minutes earlier, only this time in reverse. Once outside, she led me to a vehicle parked in front of the building. Aside from a few awkward glances by a couple of suited and booted employees, there were no signs of suspicion as I maneuvered the rug into the trunk of a Toyota Jeep, leaving a portion hanging out of the back. We pulled up to the entrance gate, which was shut. The security man who I'd seen taking a nap earlier was standing at attention before it. He strolled over and, circling the car like a drug enforcement officer, came up to my door. Looking across at Shaday, he motioned with an open hand to the back of the Jeep. Speaking in broken English, he said, "Madame, now you get this carpet." "Solomon, I beg, open the gate with a hurry," Shaday said. He took a couple of steps back from the car and gazed at the rug. "And this carpet fine, no?" He made no move to open the gate. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a 500 naira note, and handed it to him. His face broke into a broad smile. Walking over to the gate, he grabbed the handle, pulled the gate back, and rolled it all the way open. As we cruised off the premises, he said, "Go well," which I figured meant he wished us a safe journey. I turned to Shade. "Know where we can find a river?" I asked. "River?" "To dump the body." She paused to give it some thought. "Third mainland," she said. I nodded, acknowledging a structure I would later discover was the longest bridge in the country, a bridge spanning 8 miles in length, and resembled, albeit from a far enough distance, a poor man's version of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge. A short while later, we mounted one of the city's central landmarks. I gazed down at what looked like large portions of discarded litter floating in the river several feet below. Shifting my gaze south, a wide spread of derelict-looking homes in the far distance came to my attention. Fashioned of zinc material, these structures were erected on tall iron stilts and stood above the surface of the water, far from ideal, yet in the absence of suitable accommodation on land, appeared to be a last-ditch attempt at securing somewhere to live. I leaned across and punched the button on the dashboard to activate the car's hazard lights. "Find somewhere to park," I said. Shade nodded and pulled over by the side of the bridge. I jerked open the door. "You have to be quick," she said. "There are plenty of area boys around here." I gave this a second's thought and no more, figuring that by area boys she meant local thugs who, like the men I'd encountered on my journey from the airport, had, frankly speaking, more to worry about the damage I could render to them than the reverse. I circled the jeep, raised the lid of the trunk, and hoisted the assassin's body onto my shoulder. Without hesitation, I made my way to the edge of the bridge and heaved the rug overboard. I watched in silence. The rug plummeted to the river below like a giant, poorly wrapped Christmas gift. There was the distant echo of a splash as it hit the water, disappearing beneath the surface like an object consumed by the black hole of an abyss. Stepping away from the edge of the bridge, I spotted a couple of shirtless men in three-quarter shorts and flip-flops hurrying towards me. From the intense looks on their faces, I didn't need to be told that these were the so-called area boys Shade was concerned about. But I had better things to do than toss a couple of wannabe tough men into the river below. Returning to the car, I climbed back into the front passenger seat. "Let's go." As we rejoined the fast-moving traffic, I shot a glance at the rear mirror and could see the area boys running towards the car, hurling abuse. "That was close," Shade whispered. I said nothing. She looked at me. "Are you always this calm?" I didn't answer. "Do you have this man's address?" I said. She reached for a handset, thumbed the screen a couple of times, and handed me the device. An address was up on the screen: 74 Francis Close, Abuja City. I saved it on my phone after my contact called to say she was worried, Shade said. She turned to look at me. "The man's name is Simon Juku." "How long would it take to get to this place?" I said. "Half a day." "By air or road?" "Road." "And if you catch a flight?" "Probably an hour." I nodded. "Head for the airport." I handed back the phone. "We got a plane to catch." She looked at me in surprise. "We?" She paused a beat. "You just love to give orders, don't you?" I said nothing. Mimicking my speech patterns in a sarcastic tone, she said, "You're driving. Pull over. I'm using your beautiful rug to get rid of this man I just killed." I flashed a look at her, positive that I didn't phrase the last bit in those words, but still said nothing. Wouldn't hurt to say please once in a while. Again, I remained silent. I didn't care very much for polite speak or political correctness, and wasn't about to start now. "How long before we get there?" She stared at me with a look of resignation and shook her head. 20 minutes, she muttered. Chapter 24. Jonah, capital city. We arrived at Lagos City's domestic airport in just over 20 minutes and pulled into an outdoor parking lot. Climbing out of the car, we headed into the departure terminal, which, like the international airport I'd arrived at 3 days earlier, felt like stepping into the confines of a heated oven. The hall was dead silent, and the passengers waiting to board the next flight were few. I was not surprised. In a country that the average family lives on an estimated £5 a day, you didn't need a rocket scientist to determine that the preferred choice for long distance, domestic travel, was likely to be a public bus or a hired car. Heading for an airline ticket counter, I noticed Shade was taking in short, deep breaths as we approached the desk. I came to an abrupt stop. "You okay?" She paused for a moment, sucked in another deep breath, and blew the air out of her cheeks. "Flying," she said. "What about it?" "I have a bit of a phobia." "Know what the odds are of being in a plane crash?" I said. She didn't answer me and had her gaze fixed on the name of the airline printed across the window of the desk we were approaching. "Aero Contractors," she whispered, naming the airline. "What about them?" "An Abuja-bound aircraft of theirs crashed a couple of years ago." She took in another deep breath. 0 survivors. 1 in 11 million. She looked at me. "What?" "Odds of being in a crash," I said. 1 in 11 million, which still makes flying the safest way to get around. A couple of hours later, we boarded an Aero Contractors flight. After sitting through a 50-minute journey, I could tell Shade was relieved when we arrived in the nation's capital city unscathed. Contrary to what I'd seen in Lagos, the city of Abuja's domestic airport had been built to international standards. It was spacious, well lit, fully air-conditioned, and equipped with all the trappings of duty-free shopping. 30 minutes after landing, we jumped into an airport taxi. As we sped along the motorway, I noticed a difference in the layout of the land. The city appeared less populated than Lagos and had roads that were clearly in better shape. But I wasn't here for the city's optics. I was quickly reminded of what was at stake when another text message from Rambo flashed up on the screen of the assassin's mobile, which I still had in my possession. "How far?" the message said, which I figured meant, "What's the latest?" I responded using a few words to stall for more time. "Caught up in traffic." I was about to push the second option, but stopped myself. Caught up in traffic? Too British, I thought. Then I remembered the expression I'd frequently heard for slow traffic in the last 48 hours. Go slow. I deleted my original line and replaced it with, "Go slow. We'll call when I have better reception." We kept going for another 45 minutes, shooting past several modest-looking homes, a number of market stalls, and a few police checkpoints. Navigating through what seemed like the central part of the city, we arrived at the entry point of a road, which had a prominent signboard erected on a tall steel pole that read "Francis Close." "Pull over," I said to the driver. "Oga, remain small," he said, which I interpreted as meaning we were close. "Do it now," I demanded. He complied, and we climbed out of the car. As the vehicle drove into the distance, I turned to Shade. Staring at me, a mystified expression on her face, she made an open palm gesture with both hands as if to say, "What now?" I glanced across the street and spotted a small restaurant. A large sign was mounted on the building out front. "Mama Tasty." It was accompanied by a picture of a scrumptious-looking traditional dish. "Hungry?" I said. "Lost my appetite 2 hours ago," she replied. "I need a drink," I said, and headed for the restaurant. She paused for a moment, seemed somewhat confused by my actions, then quickly followed. The restaurant was quiet and had a bunch of cheap-looking plastic tables and chairs. It was neat, clean, and had a rotating ceiling fan. At just after 7 in the evening, it was blowing cool rather than hot air. We sat across from each other at a table. A plump-looking woman, who I figured was the owner, plodded over, a welcoming smile on her face. "What can I get you, sir?" she said. "A large Guinness." She turned to Shade. "And madame?" "Just a bottle of water," Shade said. "You don't want to eat something?" "Maybe later." The woman walked off to grab our orders, and Shade gazed at me. "I don't even know your name," she said. "You didn't ask." She gave me a stern look. "Jonah," I said. "Okay, Jonah, you want to tell me what we are doing here?" "Getting ready." The lady served the drinks and popped off the Guinness lid with a rusty bottle opener. "Thank you," I said. "We need to find Michael," she whispered. I emptied my bottle with 3 long swigs. "Not we," I said. When I was done, I rose to my feet. "Me." "Where are you going?" "Give me an hour," I said. "What? 1 hour," I repeated. With the blazing sun beginning to set on the horizon, I returned to the signboard for Francis Close and headed down the street. It was clearly an affluent neighborhood with gated residences on either side of the road. However, money was no substitute for class. The poor state of the road made it apparent that the residents were not particularly concerned about the overall aesthetic of the environment in which they lived. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:30 p.m. Almost 8 hours since I had first discovered Michael was missing, which, if statistics were anything to go by, left me with less than 4 hours to spare. I spotted a Mercedes-Benz 600 saloon driving towards me. Rocking gently from side to side, its large tires dipped in and out of the potholes along the road. The car was a classic 1972 jet black model, once infamous for transporting some of the world's most ruthless dictators. With stacked headlights, an impeccably polished exterior, and cream white leather seats, I gazed at the face of a uniformed chauffeur who sat behind the wheel. A craggy-faced Caucasian man, a dead ringer for Lady Penelope's butler from the 70s TV show Thunderbirds. In the back seat, his boss was perusing a newspaper, a black man kitted out in a white safari suit and a giant white Stetson hat. Gazing up from the paper, he stared directly at me, deep tribal marks on each cheek, a deformed, bloated face sitting upon a wire-thin neck. I took a mental note and plodded on. After 5 minutes, there was nothing but bushes and trees on either side of the road. Shortly afterwards, about 100 yards ahead, a large bungalow appeared. Drawing closer, I could hear music playing. I spotted a group of men who looked like they were celebrating on the patio out front. Walking briskly towards the location, I didn't have to see the number on the gates to know whose house I was looking at. It was the home of Simon Juku, and come hell or high water, he was going to take me to my brother. Chapter 25. The Quiet Man. It was late afternoon. Wearing the highest of heels and the tiniest of miniskirts, the ladies of the brothel known as Cool Breeze were already beginning to filter out into the bar with hopes of a financially profitable evening. Sitting in his favorite spot at the back of the room, Rambo drained what was left of a large mug of beer and turned his gaze to the attractive female who was tucking into a combined dish of rice, beans, and fried snails at the police officer's expense. Watching as the woman ate, it was no secret that generosity had never been one of Rambo's strongest attributes. But after a huge bribe to remain silent about the accident which had taken the lives of 2 elderly citizens, Rambo was, on this occasion, willing to make an allowance. Replaying the events of the last 24 hours in his head, he felt a touch of sympathy for the man from London. However, he was convinced his actions were, in the spirit of the Italian mafia, simply business and nothing personal. He smiled as he remembered the morning he and Juku's paths had crossed for the first time. A chance meeting that he had to thank for everything that followed, a crash witnessed in the distance while he was headed home from a night patrol, a random accident, a car veering wildly off the road and colliding with what Rambo had immediately identified as two people from the manner they bounced off the vehicle like skittles in a bowling alley. Then, like an ambulance chaser, the furious race towards the location. There he had met a frightened-looking driver attempting to flee the scene, a giant bodyguard in the front passenger seat, a severely confused-looking girl in the back. The identity of the man behind the wheel had been a surprise, a man whom Rambo had recognized as the son of Talofius Juku, the notorious ex-governor of River State. His trial and subsequent imprisonment for embezzlement could only mean his son had now become a sitting duck. A sitting duck who had taken the life of not just one, but two people. The potential charges were numerous. Aside from the smell of vodka, Juku's dilated pupils had made Rambo dead certain there had been significant drug use. Minor infractions on any other occasion, but not when there were two dead bodies to answer for. However, this was Lagos, and the opportunity at stake had been as clear as day. 100,000 naira had changed hands, payment for his silence and a brisk ride to the airport. But as luck may have it, there'd be more cash to come. Another 40,000 for delivering Michael to Juku at his home in Abuja, followed by another huge offer of cash to now have Michael's source of information eliminated. A woman who ran a private detective agency known as Moonlight Investigations Lagos. "I need proof when the job has been done," he remembered Juku saying on the phone. Proof meaning a photograph of the body before a bank transfer would be made to his personal account. Rambo smiled to himself. He had no concerns about the job being completed and had ensured he had hired the only man he felt was qualified to make it happen. A man who had never shared his name and insisted upon being called the Quiet Man. A simple, unassuming-looking individual who could disappear in a crowd and strike with the swiftness of a python when the opportunity presented itself. A man whose services Rambo had first sought 2 years ago to assist a council politician in wiping out his closest electoral rival. A job that had been swift, precise, and as the assassin's moniker implied, quiet, leaving an ambitious politician dead in the shower, his throat slashed to the bone. Balogun tapped the smartphone and the screen lit up. He looked at the last message from the Quiet Man sent a couple of hours earlier. "We'll let you know when I'm done." Balogun smiled and fired off another message. "How far?" There was a pause and then a response, a two-part response that Rambo found worrying. Not so much the first part, but definitely the second. Something was wrong, he thought. Something was seriously wrong.